Rena, can I ask, because you joined, I think, as Isabel said, in Erbil. Tell me a little bit about how you got involved in the story and some of the work you had done leading up to this.
So I got an email from the editor of the Wall Street Journal, photo editor of the Wall Street Journal, Margaret, and pitching the story and saying that we have a correspondent already in Sweden, and she's going to follow the man into Syria. And when I read that it was just one sentence: a grandfather going to rescue his 7 orphaned children from Syria. I just, my heart sank. I felt like this is one of the most important stories I'd ever get a chance to work on. I have to be honest, I have not been to Syria before, previous to this assignment. I have not been to Iraq previously to this assignment. So I've had, very little experience in that region. I have covered Syrian refugee crisis in Greece and in Turkey, but I haven't been to Syria or Iraq. But once again, when the story came to me, I jumped on it.
Isabel, I guess when you get to Erbil, what is your thinking? Because I've spent some time in the region, and although obviously never had a story like this, the logistics involved. I mean, I got to say that if someone was present to me and saying, I'm going to a refugee camp, and of course the Al-Hol camp has become infamous for this. It's huge, hard to identify people, how to track people down. You have a guy here who has not met some of his grandchildren, don't even know what they look like. What was your hope in terms of actual success in tracking down the grandchildren?
Well, Patricio had already, in advance of going there, his former partner, so the maternal grandmother of the children, who also went to Syria, she had contacts with some of the women in the camp, including the woman who had taken care of these kids after both of their parents were killed. So he was actually getting most of the information about where these kids were. And then at the same time, on the side, I was trying to double check it, just to make sure that, we knew what we were getting into. So we had kind of established before going into Syria that, well, we thought four of the children were in this hospital. They had initially been in Al-Hol camp, and then they had been transferred to this hospital. So we went there expecting to find 4 of the kids at least in the hospital, and the rest of them in Al-Hol. So it wasn't completely, we didn't go into it completely blind. Patricio he obviously had the kind of main source of information, and we were just kind of like checking that, obviously. So
tell me a little about this journey here, because you describe it in part in the piece. I mean, obviously the Iraq-Syria border at this time is a pretty difficult border to deal with, but then you also mentioned that the authority that was in control of the region where the hospital and the camp was a sub-regional governor of even that. What was that kind of journey like for you and Rena?
Well, I think any journalist who has operated in northeast Syria would agree that it's a pretty complex environment. As you mentioned, it's controlled by this autonomous administration, and they control access pretty strictly to, everywhere, all kind of key sites within the area under their control. And sometimes it's hard to know exactly why they are granting or denying access. So, I mean, the getting into Syria part was relatively straightforward, surprisingly so, apart from a sort of, there's like a floating bridge that you have to cross to enter Syria, and there was serious flooding when we intended to cross. So we got stuck for several days, and obviously Patricio was getting increasingly frustrated and desperate because he was so close and yet so far. But eventually we made it across, and then these access challenges began. So as I mentioned before, we had a pretty good idea that some of the kids were in this hospital. So that was our first port of call. And we sort of circumvented the procedures in order to get access. And which meant that once we were there, we got there, and we only, Patricio only found one of the children there. The others had already been discharged.
Can I stop you on that one? Because that's the bit of the story where I started to break down. It's just an incredibly moving scene where you are with them. And Rena, you're there too, because you this iconic photo you captured of Patricio cradling his malnourished 1-year-old, I guess, probably less than 1-year-old grandson who he's never met before. Incredibly moving. Tell me a little bit about Rena in particular, when you captured that image, what was going through your mind? Because again, for those who haven't read it, basically he's led into a room where there are dozens of unidentified babies, and he's never seen this grandchild before, and he's comparing it to his phone. Rena, if you could just talk me through about what's going through your mind in terms of the ability to capture that image, which, as I said, has really become iconic now.
Well, I mean, it was, as Isabel said, it was nerve-wracking because we sort of knew that the kids might be there, but we didn't know for sure. So we literally followed him inside the hospital, and he walks inside the hospital, and the only thing he has is a smartphone with a picture of Mohammed taken by somebody else. He's never met the child, and he just asks doctors and nurses randomly, have you seen this child? Have you seen this child anywhere? And finally, he gets directed to the floor where these like cribs, like children are lined up in cribs, and these are the children of foreign fighters. And he identifies Mohammed by the whiff of his blonde hair and the picture. He picks him up, and that's the moment when it was very difficult for me to photograph because everybody became very emotional, and Patricia obviously became extremely emotional and began to cry and speak. He was speaking to Mohammed in Swedish. He was cradling the baby, and it was really such an emotional moment. I was crying. The nurses were crying. I think everybody around him were very tense, but I kept photographing. I also felt like I needed to capture it in video, so I took some videos as well of this moment.